Okay, rolling.
Testing.
Oh, wait,
Task of the public broadcasting. Hello and welcome to In the Particles, where we gather to talk about postmodernism, creative practice and process, 6 viewpoints, Mary Overlie, and perhaps a new movement we're calling particleism. Woo! Aye! Okay, so in this episode today, we decided we wanted to tell you a little bit about Mary Overlie. So I'm just going to ask Sophia to tell us, and you can start anywhere, who was Mary? Who was Mary? Oh, Mary.
Yeah, and Sophia is speaking, by the way.
Yeah.
And there was
Hi,
Deborah.
everybody. Yeah, Deborah asked the question.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Deborah Black here, Sophia Treanor, Youlim Nam. And just to say that Sophia and Mary were very close for about a decade. And so I'm giving it to her because she knows the full faceted human being that was Mary Overlie. And that's the person that we want to remember. It's really interesting right now to be in academia, where the only thing that really matters in a lot of ways is the written word. But here we are, and hopefully people listen to this that are studying Mary's work and writing about it so that they can also understand her fullness.
Yeah, nice. Thanks for bringing that up. Mary is a force. Mary Overlie was an artist and a very important teacher to many generations of artists, and continues to be even after her death. And you know, I think the short of it is that Mary Overlie was an innovator of the world of performance. She was a choreographer, a dancer, a director, and through her work, she developed a language and a whole process. Deborah and I like to call it a technology. This theory and practice that she developed called the 6 viewpoints, which was a way of deconstructing performance, the act and process of creating performance, into 6 different languages or perspectives that really empower the artists to create their own work, while questioning maybe their own bias. But just to talk about Mary a little bit more before we get into the viewpoints, Mary was born in Bozeman, Montana, in 1946. On January 15th. She was a Capricorn. And she was born to a family in eastern Montana. They lived on a farm for the first few years of her life and then moved to Bozeman. And the Montana landscape, I think, was a really big influence on her throughout the course of her life. Hugely spacious, as well as this kind of Western state of mind, like I can do it myself. And she fell in love with dance as a child, and also lived across the street from a group of painters that she eventually called her art parents, Bob and Jenny DeWeese. And Bob and Jenny DeWeese were really, really important anchor for the modern art scene in Bozeman and the surrounding kind of rural Western America.
And Mary would just hang out with them as much as she could, put on plays for the gaggles of artists they would have for dinner parties, and was around this culture of artists talking about each other's work. And she, being so interested in dance and theater and hearing these painters talk about what they did and having all of this language, like talking about perspective and values of color and shadow, composition, the different materials they were working with. When she was a teenager, she went to the library looking for a book on theater or dance and couldn't find anything of the sort. All she could find were reviews. She came to realize that no one was really talking about live performance in a language that resonated with her or her practice. So she decided at an early age to go after the question, keep asking the question, live in the question of what is theater? What is dance? What is performance? What's happening? And
also kind of what it's made up of, right? Like the visual artists that she was around all the time, I think what I remember is that she loved how detailed their language was. And it's language that a lot of us, anybody that's taken a drawing or painting class might recognize, like perspective, foreground, background, foreshortening, those kinds of things come in, shading, hue, cross-hatching, right? All these things. And she knew that kind of detail must exist in theater. And so she was also interested in, which was where the deconstruction comes in. Like, it's not just a thing that exists. It's made up of a lot of different languages.
Yeah, and just to say, like, if we think about the way people were talking about theater or dance before the viewpoints came into being, and, a lot of trainings still have you enter into a space where you're studying theater or dance, and there's a style at play that is accepted as being what is most important. Like in today's contemporary traditional theater, we accept, often without questioning, that what's important is that we're telling a story in a way that feels emotionally realistic, to usually with a message of some kind. And the staging, the blocking, the costume, the sound, the text is all serving this particular story. And in dance, how would you describe what is the kind of accepted definition of dance?
Yeah, dance is tricky, but it depends what kind of dance you're looking at. But the steps are really important, and how the steps are activated in the body. And then there's apparently some kind of rubric around somebody who might have technique and somebody who doesn't, and that the person that's maybe trained more has a different look in their body. And so that's also valued more. And I'm talking about Western dance in that way. Although I think it happens in every dance style, that all over the world, that you are trying to look a certain way, right? There's a sort of an acceptable way to do a step. And then there's also the concept of choreography, right? Which is how steps are put together. So then there's another maybe rubric about that, how sophisticated it is, how beautiful it is it symmetrical, is it telling a story? And then dance also deals with meaning in many different ways. But in ballet, For instance, there's always a story. There's not until Balanchine do you get ballet without a story.
And then as you're talking, I'm also thinking about the quality of presence that is largely accepted, and I would say usually not spoken about, which is a quality of effortlessness in commercial performance venues. I think there's a quality of effortlessness that a lot of us who, I was trained as a Adler Stanislavski-esque actor, and you as a ballerina and dancer of all kinds, a Western dance.
Yeah.
That I imagine we were, and Youlim as an actor and a dancer, probably really, I don't know, invisibly or not, taught that it's supposed to seem like we're not performing something really challenging. Like there's a virtuosity of these things. So anyway, through many experiments and relationships, Mary started to name these things that she was not hearing any other names for. And she found herself eventually in the 1970s in the downtown dance scene of New York City, where a lot of paradigms were being tossed out the window and questioned in performance through the Judson Dance Theater and Grand Union. And she saw all of these other kinds of performance happening, and she found her community. And in that community, a lot of what was accepted in the commercial world was being like either questioned or totally thrown out the window. So throughout her life, through observing artists working and also creating work herself, she found 6 materials of performance. Woo! And
so doable, 6.
Yeah, you can almost count it on one hand. And the 6 that she articulated are space, shape, time, emotion, movement, and story. And she describes each of these materials as being their own language and having their own perspective. And perhaps even their own consciousness that we as performers are interacting with and in relationship with. And the 6 viewpoints, which is what she ended up calling her theory and the technique that she developed, is a way of becoming an observer and participant with these 6 languages or 6 materials, which is a challenge to the idea of the artist as an originator or a creator. So she was really much more interested in what happens if I observe what's happening around me and participate with it. And looked at that process, that art-making process, as something that was about cultivating and developing a conscious relationship with the materials at work and with the audience, rather than something that's guided from a point of view of the idea of the performer or the director of this should happen, so we're going to manipulate the world around us to make this particular vision happen. She also experimented with work like that It's not, this is not an either or world. It's a both and world where all of the approaches are welcome, but the call to make one's approach conscious is first. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about Mary's relationship to postmodernism?
Great question.
That's a great question. So I was just remembering right before we started recording this postcard that Mary had on her wall. It was just, she was always writing notes on these little white postcards, these blank postcards, and she would distribute them and had them all over her house. And when I was
I have some in my closet, actually. You gave me a stack of them. I have some of Mary's blank postcards.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
I should start writing notes on them.
You should, totally. And, you know, when I went through her archive, when she passed in 2020, I collected her archive at her house, and which is now being processed at NYU's Fales Performing Arts Library, which hopefully, if you're listening out there, by the time you listen to this, maybe it'll be available. Check it out. Oh, yes. So she had this one particular postcard. Oh, I was going to say all these postcards would have like a grocery list and then also some completely brilliant revelation, you know? So there's this notion inside of the Viewpoints that is about horizontality and questioning the hierarchies that we place between ourselves and others, or ourselves and the materials around us, or any specific group's interest. And I bring up this postcard because I think it's a really beautiful expression of Mary's personal relationship with postmodernism, which is the experience of multiplicity and how we can be working on multiple channels at once that all can intersect and create something completely unique without having to be a unification between the elements. So they don't have to become one thing. And it was a very short one-sentence autobiography. And it said, "I am an experimental, conservative, postmodern, classicist, Lutheran, Buddhist, Druid."
And were the words in these particular layouts, so experimental and conservative in the same line?
Yes.
Yes, and then postmodern and classicist in the same line?
Yes.
Right, and then Lutheran, Buddhist, Druid in the same line.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So these, what you might think are paradoxes, combined.
It's a bit like poetry. It's like enjambment.
What is enjambment?
Where it depends where you put the line endings. Where you put the line endings changes the meaning. So if she had said, "I'm an experimental, conservative postmodernist who's also a classicist Lutheran and practices Buddhist Druidism," that's different than saying what she did say.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you change the line endings, you change the meaning.
Yes, totally. So delicate. Yeah. Mary would say that she was a card-carrying postmodernist. So she wanted all of her students to know, first off, listen, I'm a postmodernist. You don't have to be to practice my work, but I am. And to her, postmodernism could be defined by the first three laboratories of the bridge of her theory, which was basically her description of a creative process. So the way that she invited people to enter a postmodern frame of mind, which is full of lots of potentially useless information that doesn't necessarily have to build into a singular thing and can contain multitudes, that is moving towards making art that is some kind of a communication of consciousness between the artist and the viewer, rather than about any certain subject, or maybe as well as any certain subject. So I'm not sure if this is where you were wanting me to go with this, but the viewpoints have these two basically parallel worlds. There's the 6 languages that, if you're studying the viewpoints, you get to know each of them individually, the languages they speak, the way that they
Just to
impact
remind you,
you.
that's shape, space, time, emotion, movement, and story.
Yes, exactly, which you can remember by stems with a double S, almost like you have what is it called?
Stutter.
A stutter, like stems.
Systems.
Or like systems, but without the Y.
Right.
Stems. So there's the world of the stems, or the worlds of the stems, and then there's the bridge, which is the theoretical pathway that the artist travels. And the first 3 laboratories of the bridge create Mary's definition of postmodernism. So the first laboratory of the bridge is, she would call news of a difference, which was a term borrowed from transcendental meditation, which Mary practiced and once upon a time was a teacher of. And news of a difference is about experiencing subtler and subtler information. So noticing, and then noticing more about what you're noticing, and noticing more, and noticing more. Kind of allowing your consciousness to drop down into experiencing maybe the familiar world around you in an unfamiliar way.
So would you say this is when particularism comes in?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yep. In the first bridge, or the first frame of the bridge. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You go into the particles.
Mm-hmm. And tell us, I mean,
we're going to talk about particularism.
Yeah, but the reason why this was also so profound in this moment, right, was because scientists were in that process. And in the 1940s, as we know, the atomic bomb went off in Hiroshima. And what's the other city? Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which was obviously horribly tragic, that something that happened on an atomic level, right, a particle level, could create such mass destruction. So post-atomic bomb was maybe, I mean, I wasn't alive then, so I don't know, but it was a real existential crisis. And then, of course, not too long after that, the Cold War starts, right, where there is atomic threat on a huge level every day. And it could happen at any moment.
And just to be explicit, what is an atomic bomb? It's harnessing the power
of the tiny,
breaking apart atoms.
Yes. So this is the potentially destructive side of deconstruction.
And in that time, I think the thing you're pointing to is that the power of the atom becomes we become aware of it globally. That the power of the atom starts to actually direct politics, people's actions, the way people plan their future. People are still recovering from the explosions that happen from breaking apart the particles. So scientists discovered particles, which really is just a smaller and smaller thing, but the atom. And then, of course, now we have the quantum field and strings and quarks.
Which transcendental meditation has been studied. What's his name?
Maharishi
Mahesh Yogi was a physicist. I mean, I don't think he had his doctorate in physics, but he understood the field, and he pressed academics to study transcendental meditation so that they would know it was actually quantum physics, that it wasn't something kind of woo-woo. It was actually really, and it's a practice of particleization, of noticing that the reality is a particle in nature. And so many studies have been done on transcendental meditation, academic studies, research studies. So that's really amazing, because somebody actually just said in a recent Viewpoints class of ours, wouldn't it be great if we could hook up some brain scans to Viewpoints practitioners and see how their brains are changing, just like the transcendental meditators did have that done, and they could see what happened to their brains after a certain amount of practice. So yes, it is the awareness of something on a particle level has the ability to change things, as we saw in a bomb, right? I mean, like, it's huge, the reverberations of that.
And I was actually reading one of Mary's papers recently, because I'm moving. I moved today. I'm in the process of moving. And so I'm going through all of these paper objects that I have. And I was reading in a notebook of mine from, like 2017 or something, that Mary had written in my notebook, that particlism preceded postmodernism. That particlism, which is I think the era that we're talking about, when the particle becomes something that people are aware of, gave way to postmodernism, which, is after modernism, the preceding major artistic movement, which we'll talk more about. But I just thought that was so interesting that we've been talking about particlism between the three of us as an art movement that maybe we're all a part of, that we're all doing, because postmodernism has so many meanings. And this feels a little more specific, at least for me, that I can identify with. And it's interesting to explore the idea of what it might be, and how we might talk about it. But it felt so beautiful to read Mary's handwriting. Like, particlism was the seedbed for postmodernism. So the second laboratory of the bridge is deconstruction. So you can imagine how, if you're noticing things on subtler and subtler levels, if you're moving into a realm of consciousness that feels like you're particleizing, so you're noticing the shapes, you're noticing space, you're noticing the time qualities, you're noticing the differences in experience or in your consciousness, then you can start pulling things apart and opening up what you may have conceived of as being objects or a thing, and taking them apart, seeing how they meet, seeing if the way that they meet gives you the meaning of the thing. And then the third laboratory of the bridge is what you might do with all of these different parts that you find in the particles, which is you lay them out so you can see all of them with equal importance and with an equally good view of each of them, which is the laboratory of the horizontal. So you are noticing a subtler and subtler difference. You start taking things apart with your perception, and then you can look at them with a horizontal frame of mind rather than a hierarchical frame of mind, which the hierarchy might just be giving something a meaning that it doesn't inherently have, you know. But Mary articulated all of this, but she also was a lover of postmodern art and philosophy.
Can you name a few of the things that she loved, either artists or philosophers or philosophies?
Yeah.
She absolutely loved Jacques Derrida and Marcel Duchamp. She thought that Marcel Duchamp's read of the modernists just being in love with the smell of paint and painting just because they were in love with the paint itself and not because they necessarily had something that needed to come through them or out of them. And I think it was really Marcel Duchamp's writing that led Mary to this conviction that making art is making something conscious and transmitting consciousness. Other postmodern artists that she loved were Richard Serra.
R.I.P.
R.I.P. Richard Serra.
A couple of weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah.
Richard Serra made huge sculptures, often very geometrical in nature, often interrupting people's journey to work. I think one was even taken down here in New York City because people got so mad about it because they had to walk around it to get to work. Look that up. But yeah, he would put often, like, there's one at, I think it's at Mass Mocha or in Dia Beacon. It's just big cubes in the room, and you would think like, oh, that's nothing, but it's so incredible to be around these huge objects. And really about space and shapes.
And scale. Like putting my experience with the few Richard Serra pieces that I've gotten to experience is that I am entering a world where scale operates completely differently than what I'm used to. So what I'm aware of changes entirely. Yeah. She was a student and friend of Steve Paxton, also R.I.P. He just recently died.
Yeah, maybe 3 months ago.
Yeah.
He was the person, he didn't do it alone, but he's often credited for the emergence of contact improvisation, which I don't know if it was Mary. I think it was Mary who said this about him. He looked at dancers on stage and he said, why are there always 3 feet between them? Unless they're doing like some kind of romantic pas de deux. And he said, what if we and we're like 3 feet apart, all of us, right? It's this sort of...
He was dancing for Merce Cunningham.
Who hated when people touched each other on stage. Yes, he had this whole thing where he didn't want people to be partnering or touching each other. He didn't want that kind of relationality kind of coming up. So Steve, he was like, well, let's interrogate the space between us. And he was also doing Aikido practice at the time, and Nancy Stark Smith was one of his collaborators, and there's some beautiful videos of those two and a few other people experimenting early days of contact improvisation on YouTube. But you can really start to see how they were working in a way that nobody that I know of. Maybe there were other dancers somewhere in the world in a different time in history doing this. But they were tumbling, they were finding fulcrum points on each other's bodies, they were climbing up on one another, they were flying towards one another, flying off one another, onto the floor, rolling, I mean, really working also with another aspect of physics, really. So in a lot of ways, very scientific, very, very experimental. How do we do this? And I talked to KJ Holmes, who was a very early on student of Steve and Nancy, and she still teaches contact now. And she was saying, like, they were really experimenting. It looks, when you watch these videos, you might see like, oh, this looks chaotic, or this looks like a mess. Some people have watched it and say that looks dangerous. They shouldn't have been doing that. But KJ said, no, they had such fixed experiments, not only in what they were doing with each other's bodies, but then how they were passing it on to people. So there was a pedagogical aspect to CI that started almost immediately. How did we just do that? Let's figure it out. So they were really, really in a deep scientific experiment, I think, even though it was aesthetic. It started with aesthetic idea, but it went really into science.
And then my understanding is that through the experiment, the dance was exposed. That this contact improvisation as a dance form arose as a result of this experimentation, and that every single time you go into contact with somebody, you're doing this experiment again, and so the dance is discovered completely fresh.
Yes.
And it's so a complete left turn away from the idea of steps that we were talking about earlier, where you know what's going to happen, or how exactly it's going to happen, or that you as an individual are the dancer.
Yeah, and you really have to get really, really in tune, maybe on a particle level, with your own body and where weight is going and where it's traveling towards and traveling away from. Because me dancing with Sophia would be very different than me dancing with somebody who was maybe 6 feet tall. So the way that I would enter into those dances would be very, very different. Even if maybe the same like trick or same idea that came in, it would feel different and it would look different. So a practice of contact is really a practice of presence, and brings us back to the news of a difference, because it's really about negotiating change, constant change, through movement.
And when was that?
This was in the early 70s.
Early 70s.
He started
69,
developing it.
70, 71.
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s, and I don't know, and was working at it for 20 years, and then and throughout that time, it like took off completely, and now it's all over the world.
So that was the birth of contact improv. So what's contact improv?
Oh, we just...
For those who don't know.
Well, we just explained it.
That what we were just
So,
talking about is contact improv.
Yeah, contact improvisation. You can Google it right now and find a jam near you, probably. It's an improvisation, and the bodies are in contact, and it's working with different principles of weight sharing, balance transfer. There's often different kinds of lifts and rolls and all sorts of things. So it's in a certain way, in terms of Western dance, it's one of the few things that was really innovated.
Yeah, Mary would call it the first post-colonial era American folk dance.
Yes. And it sort of does exist that way. People who don't consider themselves to be any kind of other dancer at all show up to a contact jam, and they take contact classes. I used to work at a contact community where, people of all kinds came, because it really is kind of a folk dance. Anyone can do it. There's no expectation for being good or bad or anything, but it really also is about like how you come into relationship with somebody you don't know through dance, just like you would in a tango or foxtrot.
And traditionally, just to maybe paint a visual picture, if you can imagine two people finding a point of contact with each other, maybe it's hand to hand or forehead to forehead or shoulder to back or
so you're using all surfaces
of the body, and the two bodies come together in a surface that is changing. So you're following the way that contact point is changing, and the body is just serving the point of contact.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's crazy things that happen, like lifts and tumbles and, flips and jumps, like Deborah was saying.
Yeah, I mean, it can get really virtuosic, honestly,
Yeah.
like the more you practice. And there are people that teach skills that, like if you want to do some of the like harder skills, you can learn them. But maybe we should end because I think we should maybe have one more question, but you look like you have something
I
to say.
just wanted to bring up John Cage
Oh, yeah.
before we end, as an artist who was a major influence on Mary and was a part of, I think, her relationship with postmodernism.
Yeah.
John Cage was a radical composer, musician, who really questioned, as Mary was doing with theater, he really questioned the definition of music, and invited silence into his work. He invited chants into his work. And his whole career was really about discovering music and then sharing what he discovering it as found sound, the way Marcel Duchamp would bring in a found object, just something they found, be like, oh, it's art. I'm hearing something. I'm going to call it music. How does shifting my perspective on it change the way I experience it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought it might be nice to end with maybe some contemporary artists that Mary influenced that people might look up. Like who do you think is out there that Mary has influenced with this way of thinking and working?
Oh, great. Well, a great person to check out is Moises Kaufmann, who's the founder of the Tectonic Theater Project. He's a theater director. He was a student of Mary's at ETW and was really deeply impacted by her deconstruction, really, and developed a way of working that named the materials that he was interested in working with, kind of created his own set of viewpoints that served his work.
Would you like to maybe
I think
talk
Maybe
about ETW for
No.
those who don't know?
Oh, I think maybe let's name a couple more artists, and then maybe that should be another episode to BD because we're over time for what we decided. Time.
time.
So who else would you say, like, go out and see what this artist is doing?
I think you should go out and check out the Million Underscores.
Yes.
Right.
Nicolas Noreña and Timothy Scott have an incredible theater company who they're developing work currently. Go to their website. They're
Based in New York.
City.
And performs in New York. In Europe a lot, I think, right?
Yeah, in Europe.
Sometimes.
And yeah, I love their work so much.
Yeah. And one more? Can you think of one more?
Well, a very big name that Mary was a huge influence to is Anne Bogart, who's often credited with the creation of the viewpoints, but it's not true.
Yes.
To do our due diligence here at the end of this episode.
Yeah, a very a beloved director, and was the head of a city company, a theater company, and they really popularized the viewpoints. They taught it all over.
Just parts of it, though. They did not know the full bridge, and they have a different list of materials, and Anne has now publicly declared that she should have changed the name. So that's the truth.
I noticed you guys call just viewpoints instead of 6 viewpoints. Is there any...
Mary called it different things, right? I mean, at some point, the two words were separated.
I think it's interchangeable.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have gotten into the habit of saying the 6 viewpoints to remind people of Mary's original 6 viewpoints. It's a little bit of like an emphasis on the stems, but they're interchangeable, I would say.
And I think it's important to know that it's really the viewpoints point to, let's just reverse the word. It's about points of view, right? And it's that there are multiple points of view. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that it's not like a brand name. It's not like it's not Adidas or something like that. It's really about the concepts embedded inside of it, which is about the fact that, as Sophia so eloquently spoke about, that dance and theater are not just dance and theater. They're made up of many different materials. And those many different materials can become our points of view, right? They're points of entry. And that this idea of view in Bradford, one of Mary's friends and students,
Bradford Rosenbloom,
was talking about how he's really focusing, and we should interview him, was talking about how he's really interested in the word view right now in like the Buddhist sense, but being able to see more. And so I think that that's also important. I think that Anne Bogart's theft of them and production capitalization on them made it seem like, I mean, people use the word like it's a verb, like you're viewpointing, like it's like like you're salsa dancing or something, that the viewpoints are something that's a kind of style, and can create a kind of stylized theater. This is very incorrect in my opinion.
It's more like philosophy.
Yes.
It's a philosophy, and also I think really, really importantly, it is something to enhance your perception and your options in your creative process, so that you can go further in your work.
Yeah.
I think in my opinion, Mary's greatest contribution as a teacher, besides this body of work that she made called The Viewpoints and her own dances, is that she really enabled her students, whether she taught them in person or people who study them without even meeting her. She enabled them to find their work and to make work that was not necessarily an iteration of something they had seen before. It was not necessarily something based on a form of like a received narrative of what the form is. But that she's really asking all of us to find our work and make our work, because it is the evolution of consciousness in our species.
Yeah, so it's deeper level of questioning about your work.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like style or any kind of, it's more deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you have a practice, go make your work.
Go make your work.
Oh, can I mention this? So the book by Mary Overlie is available, called...
Yes, Standing in Space, the 6 Viewpoints Theory and Practice it was published in 2016. And Mary worked on this book for like 20, 30 years, and
we're lucky to have that piece of
really lucky
written
to have
word, because the written word, like I said at the beginning, it does mean something. So we're very lucky to have that, but we're also very lucky to hear from Sophia.
And Deborah.
And Deborah.
And Youlim.
And Youlim.
And all of the people who are trying to share this work. But the Standing in Space is an articulation of the philosophy of the viewpoints, and there's also a practice manual at the end of it with a bunch of practices and stories about how Mary discovered the different viewpoints and how she developed the theory. And it's available on the Six Viewpoints website, both digitally and physically. Highly, highly recommend it.
The book cover is just beautiful.
It is. Yeah.
It's a beautiful book.
It's a picture of Mary's arm hanging off a boat.
All right, I think we'll wrap today's episode up, but we're not going to forget about ETW if you're all interested in that we touched upon. But
thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Bye.
Until soon.
If you like this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Bye!